If there's one thing I love, it's Sonic recolors. Particularly Sonic recolors that cropped up in fairly obscure Sonic the Hedgehog media. Obviously, we all know Shadow the Hedgehog, and most of us know Scourge the Hedgehog. But did you know there's a Sonic clone character who actually easily bested Sonic in a race and then never appeared again? I want to once again dive into the annals of Fleetway's Sonic the Comic in this video and introduce you to this guy, Turbo, who debuted in 1999 in the short story called Space Race, towards the end of Sonic the Comic's existence. He's a character who has largely been forgotten, but I think that's a shame, because, well, let me tell you. First of all, by running through the excellent Space Race storyline. The Space Race two-parter starts in issue 161 from July 1999. For context, and I'll get into this more in the second part of the video, Sonic and Amy were currently on a planet called Shanazar, which is in reality a submolecular world accessible by shrinking down to subatomic level. Sonic ended up here by using Knack the Weasel's shrinking device in pursuit of Dr. Robotnik, who himself was shrunk down to this size by the Chaos Emeralds. It's a long story, but most of Shanazar up until this point had an Arabian aesthetic. This issue, however, deviated from Shanazar's vibe. It starts with Sonic and Amy wandering into a very futuristic zone. Weirdly, everyone there seems to already know who Sonic is because, in Truman Show style, they've been watching Sonic's Shanazar antics on the television, or I guess on live stream. These guys are such big fans of Sonic that they've chosen him as their representative for the Space Race, which is apparently a Shanazar tradition. At that moment, Sonic and Amy are beamed up to a UFO where they meet an alien called Skorg, who forces Sonic into representing him in the Space Race after kidnapping Amy. Amy kidnapping, one of the oldest traditions in Sonic media. As the fastest thing alive, you'd think Sonic could quickly save Amy, but I digress. For the sake of the story, he doesn't. Instead, Sonic accepts the Space Race challenge and then is beamed down to an asteroid belt. There, he meets his opponent, a yellow and orange space hedgehog by the name of Turbo. Really cool design on this guy. Obviously a lot like Sonic, but different enough to still feel interesting. The race concludes quite quickly in this issue, and Turbo actually beats Sonic. Now, to be completely fair, Turbo is a veteran of the Space Race challenge, and Sonic struggles with the change of gravity in the asteroid belt, which does give him a bit of an out, but it's still a fairly important event. Sonic was beaten clean, which is something that I don't think had ever happened before, so quite the monumental moment. Should this be a bigger deal, or was Sonic at too big of a disadvantage for it to be significant? Whatever the case, Turbo is presented as a fairly humble and polite guy, in contrast to cocky Sonic. I get the feeling that he's maybe a little bit older. Like Sonic, he's been coerced into racing because his family is in peril and being held by the alien race that he represents in this space race. Now, while the space race is going ahead, Amy uses her handy headband as a weapon to free herself and reprimand Skorg's ship. The story concludes in issue 162. Turbo has some very bad news. It's customary for the loser's ship to be destroyed post-race. And of course, Amy is still on board piloting the ship that brought Sonic here, so her life is in peril. The Vargs, the aliens who Turbo represents, bombard Skorg's ship, disabling its main control panel, and they begin to beam Turbo back up. Sonic jumps into the teleportation beam and causes some chaos on the Varg's ship. Sonic gets tasered and temporarily reprimanded by one of the Vargs, but his heroics inspire Turbo to join in, and together they batter the Vargs and take over their ship. The story has a fairly unfulfilling conclusion. Sonic and Amy are dropped back off at Shanazar, and seemingly, Turbo pilots his ships home after the Vargs and Skorg call a truce. I assume this incident caused the space race tradition to come to an ignominious end, but we don't get to see Sonic or Amy help Turbo again, which is a bit of a shame. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because Turbo is kind of fascinating. He's got an awesome design, and like many in the Sonic fandom, for some reason, I really like designs that are essentially just Sonic recolors. However, I think there's enough uniqueness to his design to make him memorable. The way he speaks and even his subtle facial expressions paint him as a lot more mature than hot-headed Sonic. He's not cocky or insulting or joking, he's just getting the job done and actually being fairly polite to Sonic. The personality difference is conveyed really well by both Richard Elson's artwork and Lou Stringer's writing. Of course, he has that signature snarl that all of Elson's character designs would have. More than anything else, it's somewhat curious that characters like Supersonic and also fellow one-off villain Extra Life have enjoyed such a high level of popularity on the internet, but Turbo has never really garnered anyone's attention, despite the fact that he cleanly and easily beat Sonic in a race, which is no mean feat at all. This is kind of a call to action of sorts. I can't really find any love for Turbo online, there's not much fan art, there's nothing. I'd love to see the Sonic community create more cool fan art around Turbo. I mean, look at him, he deserves it. But another reason I wanted to briefly discuss Turbo is because his story sums up both the best and the worst of Fleetway Sonic the comic. The story itself is svelte and exciting, packing a decent story into a few pages. As always, Elson's art is phenomenal. I can't believe that in 1999, kids used to get artwork of this quality every fortnight. I think Elson is really in his element as well when he's dealing with aliens and sci-fi elements. You can see his artwork also in 2000 AD, which is a very long-running sci-fi compendium comic book here. You can see aliens very similar to Skorg and the Vargs in 2000 AD. The writing, on the other hand, is, I think, the weak point. Essentially, Lou Stringer, the writer, gets the job done. It's a creative and fairly memorable little two-parter. However, as I mentioned earlier, this story kind of destroyed the wider story that had been dominating the comic for months until this point. The Shanazar story was the brainchild of Nigel Kitching, and it was the first major storyline the comic had had that wasn't tied to one of the Sonic games. It was a totally original creation, and it presented to readers a world that was unlike anything they'd seen before. Shanazar was a magical place, full of monsters, genies, and dark magicians. It had a surprisingly sinister atmosphere, and it was also a place where, unlike Mobius, Sonic was hated and reviled by the locals for being an outlaw, and was hunted down by the royal family of Shanazar and by bounty hunters. The ambience and storytelling was just so rich. Rather unceremoniously though, Kitching was dropped from his writing duties after a creative fallout with the comic's editorial team before finishing the Shanazar story. Lou Stringer, who was a veteran of Sonic the comic, was brought in to continue writing the main Sonic story in Kitching's place. Stringer generally specialised more in light-hearted and shorter one-off or two-parter stories, and he immediately steered away from the main themes of the Shanazar story and essentially turned Shanazar into Mobius 2.0, with all sorts of different zones like this futuristic one, which kind of destroyed Shanazar's mystique instantly. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that this story was released at exactly the same time as Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. This was an absolutely monumentally huge movie at the time. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone had an opinion on this movie, and there was Star Wars merchandise everywhere you looked. Sonic the comic was often informed and inspired by contemporary movies and the like, so I have no doubt that this was the primary inspiration for a space-themed storyline. Heck, issue 161 had a Star Wars free gift taped to the front of the comic, and 162 had a Star Wars-themed fan art page. That's all fine and dandy, but the sudden change in environment felt like a cheap rug pull at the time. I'm often a defender of the Fleetway comics, and for good reason I think, but this thing did have a tendency to happen. Fleetway towed the line between being a bog-standard kids comic that was kind of silly and light-hearted, and something a little bit bigger. And as much as I love Turbo and Space Race, I'm conflicted because deviating from an established storyline just to cash in on Star Wars wasn't great. I've seen some people being very nostalgic about Sonic the comic and comparing it favourably to the IDW comic, for example. But IDW has had some really fun, long-running storylines in the past that haven't been interrupted by mini-stories designed for short-term game. Whatever the case, I guess you have to take the good with the bad sometimes. Space Race marked the abrupt end of one of my favourite Fleetway storylines, but it introduced me to my favourite little Fleetway side character. Is there anybody else that's actually beaten Sonic clean in a race, except for, well, I guess, Dr. Eggman in some of the earlier games? I don't know. Please let me know in the comments if you can think of anybody, because for me, this is the main appeal of Turbo. He looks cool, and he's faster than Sonic, guys. Thanks for listening to the brief story of Turbo the Space Hog, a largely unknown but very cool little character. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.